And I remember doing one with the Deputy Foreign Minister with responsibility for Asia, who said to me, "We're going to pull out of Afghanistan." And I thought, yeah, propaganda. And I reported it, and, it went out on the headline on the BBC World Service. But I didn't think, wow, this is it, because I didn't know whether to believe him or not.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
Poland's military leader, General Jaruzelski, urged the Polish people tonight not to demonstrate on Tuesday, the second anniversary of the founding of the banned trade union Solidarity.
Just down this road, the South Vietnamese forces regrouped once again, and were trying to fight off the advancing North Vietnamese.
Well, if there was a third man, were you in fact the third man?
No, I was not.
You think there was one?
No comment.
5, 2, 7, 1, 6, 6, 9, 8, 3.
Today we have another Cold War contribution from James, who is taking the helm again with a fascinating chat with Bridget Kendall, the BBC's Moscow correspondent from 1989 to 1995, when she was witness to the power struggles in the Soviet Communist Party as Mikhail Gorbachev tried to introduce reform. However, before we start, I'd like to thank our fans who are helping the podcast financially. So how do you join this select band? Well, sign up to Patreon. For the price of a couple of coffees a month, you can help cover the show's increasing costs, keep us on the air, and you get the sought-after Cold War Conversations coaster too. Just go to patreon.com/coldwarpod. That's patreon.com/coldwarpod. You can also help us by leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts, aka iTunes, Stitcher, our Facebook page, or with your favourite podcast provider. This really helps raise our profile and get new guests on the show. So back to today's episode. I'm delighted to welcome back James and his Cold War conversation with Bridget Kendall.
So Bridget, thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Welcome to Peterhouse.
Thank you. So I read somewhere that Russia has been in your blood from a very young age. Why is that? How did that come about?
It's not literally in my blood. I haven't got any Russian ancestry at all. It came about because I was at school, actually here in Cambridge. And in those days, we had O-levels, what now would be GCSEs. And in my school, you could specialise a bit. And you could take up an extra language besides French and Latin. And the choice was ancient Greek, German, or Russian. And for me, it was no contest. I wanted to learn Russian. It seemed much more exotic, more politically exciting, with a massive literature. And I absolutely fell in love with it straight away. So I started learning aged 14, did it intensively, did an A-level course, then studied it at university. And by then, my ambition was to get to the Soviet Union. In those days, it's hard to remember, but it was really hard to get there. Private enterprise was banned in the communist Soviet Union, so you couldn't go and work for somebody unless you were a nanny to a Western diplomat, perhaps. And as a tourist, you could only go on very brief visits of 3 days or 7 days, and you were followed everywhere or guided everywhere you went by in-tourist guides. And it was really very hard to go, but there were British Council scholarships available for a very, very few, and I was lucky enough to get one. And by the time I went there in the mid-1970s and spent a year there in the provinces, I was totally hooked.
And what was it that hooked you about the Soviet Union?
Well, I think initially what hooked me was Russian language and literature, actually. It was I loved the language. It's Indo-European, but it's quite different from the grammar and the structure that we have. It declines a lot. It's a bit like speaking Latin in that way. It has a very different way of dealing with action, verbs. And so you have to sort of slightly switch your mind, and that was already an intellectual challenge and very intriguing. And then once you got over the different alphabet and the different grammar and everything, there was this amazing literature. I mean, I don't need to tell everybody. Everybody knows Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Bulgakov, and so on. So, and when you speak the language, you then open up a whole new world of poetry, which is almost untranslatable. So that was what excited me first and foremost. When I got there as a student, I then realized that that was Russia, but then there was also the Soviet Union, which is what Russia had been part of the Soviet Union since 1917, since the Bolshevik Revolution, the communists took over. And this was a whole political superstructure over it, which was a fascinating world. And it was a bit like suddenly finding yourself on Mars or on the moon. It was a different world. And because in those days, way before digital communications, it really was very cut off from the West. People there knew so little about our world, and I realized we didn't know that much about their world, and that that was really, really interesting, and I felt so privileged to be one of these few people who had access to it.
And draw a contrast between Cambridge in the UK in the mid-70s and the Soviet Union in the mid-70s. What was it like to live there, to survive there, to work there?
So this is a provincial town called Voronezh, in fact a city. I think 1 million inhabitants. It's about halfway between Moscow and the Black Sea. Industrial, in the middle of the Black Earth region, so very rich agricultural soil all around, but deeply provincial, deeply conservative, if you like, and loyal. And I think one of the reasons that we were sent there, there were about a dozen of us, British undergraduates who were sent there, was because the authorities thought we wouldn't get into trouble, because there really were very few dissidents. I said this to a Russian friend just the other day, actually. We were having a bit of a reunion. She said, well, of course there were dissidents. I said, yes, but they were private dissidents. Yeah. I mean, we could walk around the town. I'm sure the KGB didn't need to enlist very many people to look out for us, because it was obvious who we were. We wore different clothes. We had different ways of speaking. We stuck out like a sore thumb. So in that way, I think they felt we were safer. And what we got was an insight into what life was really like. You know, away from Moscow, I mean, everyone talks about the queues and the shortages of the Soviet Union, but in provincial Soviet Russia at that time, it was unbelievable. I mean, there was no meat in the town. No meat. You couldn't go into the butcher's shop, didn't have any meat. It just had sausages and salami. And you go to the market where the peasants could sell private things, and there might be a couple of scrawny chickens, but almost nothing. So we lived on a diet of tinned fish and dairy products and eggs, and that was about it. And then everything else you could find in the shops, and even vegetables was a problem. I remember when I arrived in November, I arrived a little late. I was waiting for a visa. You go along to the vegetable shop, ovoshi it's called, the vegetables, and there were potatoes and onions and garlic and beetroot and apples and cabbage. So okay, you can make a decent vegetable soup. We went to Moscow for a little bit over Christmas, and when I came back and went along to the vegetable shop with my bag to go shopping in the end of January, there were potatoes, onions, garlic, and that was it. And that was it until May, when the fresh cucumbers and tomatoes were available. Why? Because they didn't import anything, certainly not to Voronezh, from abroad. And Soviet production and agriculture was so disorganized, so dysfunctional, there really wasn't any way to conserve anything, or refrigeration. Of fresh lettuce, dream on. And this was the way people lived. There was no coffee, there was no oranges. I remember one day saying to my Soviet roommates, I need to go to the big shop in the high street I need to get something to darn my woolen jumper, I've got a hole in it. And they said, what are you going to buy? I said, well, I'm looking for a needle and, some wool. And they laughed, they hooted. They said, don't be so silly, you can't buy those in the shop. And I said, well, what do you do if you get a hole in your sweater? They said, well, we unravel an old one. So this was a world of the economy by now, in the mid-1970s, the Soviet economy was slowly grinding to a halt. Yes, there were the magnificent grain harvests that were talked about in the official newspapers, and the certain sectors of the economy connected with the military and defence and research were well provided for, and the party, of course, which had special shops and special places to live and access to going abroad. But for ordinary people, especially if you were out of Moscow or St. Petersburg, which was a bit of a showcase for foreign visitors, somewhere like Voronezh, life was grim. And that's before you get to things like medicines, really crucial things, or other things that we would think of. Cleaning fluids. There was no cleaning fluid. This Russian friend I was talking to the other day, she said, I was so surprised when I came to the UK that you have plugs for your basins and you put hot and cold water in. We always just ran very hot, running hot water to wash things. And I said, yes, that's because you had no detergent. And we remembered that and smiled and laughed together. But it was an extraordinary place. And if you compare it coming from a place like Cambridge, this beautiful city with its medieval spires and parks and gardens, and interesting little shops, antique shops and bookshops and what have you, cafes. You go to somewhere like Voronezh. The first few weeks I kept getting lost because I hadn't realised that going down the street you always orientate yourself by shop signs and things that are different. There was nothing, just grey monolithic buildings with generic titles. So the vegetable shop was called Vegetable, and the fruit shop was Fruit, Frukti, and the meat shop was Miasa. And there was very little signposting that we're now used to in a market economy. And it really did feel as though I was on another planet.
So they didn't window dress it to any extent for you?
No, not for us.
They gave it to you as it was?
Interestingly, they rightly surmised that no one would listen to students coming back from the Soviet Union. I used to wonder about that, because what we saw and our access to ordinary Soviet people and the stories we heard were told a very different story from the story of the mighty Soviet threat. I had one friend during the year, I found a drama group. I was desperate to just speak Russian. I didn't want to speak English, so I went off to find clubs of Russians, and I joined a drama group, and he was in the group. He wasn't a good student. He failed his exams and was kicked out and was sent off to the army. That's what would happen to you if you're a Soviet young man. If you didn't go to university, you were sent to the army. So he was in the army in the Urals, but he used to come back and see us, and what he told us, I remember he would tell us about how his friends who were conscripts, they were all conscripts, who were attached to the Air Force, they didn't, the chemicals they had to, the spirit they had to clean the engines, they didn't clean the engines, they just drank it. So number one, what was that doing to their insides? And number two, these machines were never serviced. So little details like that, you'd sort of think that the Soviet authorities wouldn't want us to know. But they were right, nobody in Britain cared what we had to say. And the story of the mighty Soviet Union went on. And of course, there was another side to it. We were on the underbelly, but there was the military-industrial complex, the defense research institutes, if you look at their record on their space program, they had their own fibre optics. Where it mattered, they were able to pour money into that research. So it wasn't untrue that the Soviet Union was something to fear. It's just that when you came down to the nitty-gritty, there was an awful lot of corruption and bureaucracies and dysfunctionality at the same time.
Then you joined the BBC and started to engage a little bit more with Russia on a professional, or Soviet Union on a professional level. How did that play out for you?
Well, I joined in 1983, so I went back to Moscow for a year as a postgrad in 82, realising Brezhnev was very ill and was probably going to die. I mean, everybody realised that. And I also thought there weren't that many jobs in academia in Russian. And I also thought it would be actually very interesting to be a journalist and watch this close up and not read about it in libraries later. But I was a bit conflicted because I realised as a student I'd had fantastic access, especially that year in Moscow. I got to know loads and loads of people, and I would sometimes meet foreign correspondents and realise how constrained their lives were and how difficult it was for them to meet people. Ordinary Russians were scared to talk to foreign correspondents in case it got them into trouble. So I thought it would be good to be a journalist, but I was also worried about what that would do if I were to come back and have to report on this place, and would that put my friends in danger? So when I joined the BBC initially, I joined the World Service Current Affairs Department, and I did lots of things without coming to Russia. I reported on the Greek elections. I went to Berlin. Now that was a Cold War story. It was 1985, and it was the anniversary of D-Day. So what would that be? 40 years. And I was sent by my department to Berlin to make a documentary program and to look for people who'd been there on June the 6th, 1945. And I wish now I'd kept their material, because I found the most amazing people. 2 or 3 who'd hidden in the latter days of the war. A little Jewish woman who'd been hidden by a German family, a bit like Anne Frank, and had lived in a cellar. And then she said, when they said, you can come out, the war's over, she came out, and she said the whole of Berlin was covered with tents and smoking fires, and Soviet soldiers from Central Asia, all Asian looking, and she was terrified. So that was her particular memory of it. And another man, a German, who'd been a member of the officers' plot, the officers who tried to assassinate Hitler, failed plot. So he'd had to go into hiding, and he too had been hidden by friends for the whole of the war, but came out on D-Day. And then we met someone who'd been in Hitler Youth. It's also interesting. So, and then, as part of that assignment, I was told I also had to go to East Berlin. These people I interviewed in West Berlin. So I went across into East Berlin and did a couple of interviews. Of course, they were very official interviews. They weren't going to let me just talk to people off the street.
They were stage managed by the states.
Yeah. And I was used to that from the Soviet Union. It's what you'd expect. But I mean, it's still interesting to see that. And most of all, it was interesting to be in East Berlin and see how it looked different. And I remember how it smelt different, because the petrol was, I guess it was all unleaded, and probably less, there were less...
That's more sulphur in it, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was very sort of sweet. I remember it from the Soviet Union. It's the same smell of something which was not filtered out, which in West Berlin was filtered out. And then, the other usual things that were typical of the Soviet bloc, which is far fewer cars, because it's very, very hard to get a private car. More bicycles, lots of people walking, lots of people carrying bags, because you always, in a deficit economy, had a bag just in case you saw something in a shop and could rush in and join a queue. And people walking and not making eye contact, because public space was a place where you kept yourself to yourself, because who knows who you were talking to. And only at home did you open up. Yeah, this is jumping ahead now, but I remember when the Soviet Union ended, by then I was Moscow correspondent, and the fear of the party and the KGB disappeared. It was very quick that people began to make eye contact on the street. So that's an interesting side to that.
I think even now when you go to Berlin, if you go on the television tower, on the very kitsch revolving restaurant, and you look east, particularly at night, it still looks different to the west.
It's
the way
darker?
The street slightly darker, the streets are laid out in a slightly more linear fashion.
Yes. Well, that's to do with the old Berlin capital and where the capital was, I suppose. I mean, go to Moscow now, it's full of bright lights.
I wonder the place where you first visited in the Soviet Union. I wonder, have you been back to there?
Voronezh. I've been back a couple of times. I haven't been recently. There was a big celebration there last year. Sadly, I wasn't able to go. My friends say it's very transformed. But I went back when I was in Moscow in 1982, and that was interesting, because by now the economy was even more dysfunctional. My Moscow friends were telling me how bad it was, how you were having to queue for stuff, and how things that had been available before weren't. I remember the food minister went on Soviet television in May to say there was a crisis in agriculture, which is unheard of. Everyone isn't all we could talk about for the next week, because the communist authorities never admitted that anything was wrong. Everything was going towards the shining heights of communism, and here was the food minister admitting there was a crisis. And I knew that because a few weeks before I'd been back in Voronezh to visit an old friend. Still snowy, it was April, snow on the streets, and my friends were telling me how terrible it was in the shops, and that now even dairy products were not really available. And the traditional Russian fare for Easter is something called Pascha and Kalich. It's a cake a bit like a panettone, and a kind of cream with crystallized fruits in it. And the ingredients for this were not available. You need cottage cheese and eggs and various things. So everyone was very cross. And who was cross most of all? The old ladies who still went to church, because this is an Orthodox tradition. And I remember walking down the main street, Revolution Prospect, and as usual, big black car going down the centre of the road, which is what the party officials used. And these two old ladies just went out onto the snowy street and stopped in front of the car and shook their fists so that the car had to brake and then swerve around them and go on. I was just astonished. I mean, it's unbelievable that someone should demonstrate that sort of rebellious spirit in public, because you could be whisked away and arrested. I mean, when I was there as a student, I remember there was an old lady who suddenly had the bright idea, why didn't she bake cakes and take them to sell to people waiting in the long bus line in the snowy winter, because that would be nice for them to have a hot cake. Of course she was arrested, because that was private entrepreneurship and it was banned. But now, roll on, 5 years later, here were these old ladies shaking their fists at party cars. So I knew there was a crisis. And of course, that was one of the early signs which were to unravel towards the decision of the Politburo in 1985 to bring in Gorbachev, who famously said to his wife on the eve of taking the job, we can't go on living like this, and he realised things had to change, although, of course, he didn't realise it was all going to unravel quite so fast. But by now, 1985, so I'd become a BBC journalist for 2 years. When Gorbachev came, that was really a step change, because he very quickly made it clear that it was not going to be business as usual, and that people could speak out. Glasnost was the other slogan besides perestroika, which means openness. And that meant a different deal for journalists, because suddenly then the party was giving permission for ordinary people to express their views. And so I became a journalist at just the right time, really.
Was that a vehicle for him to hear dissent, to help make the changes that he wanted to make, that he realised needed to be made?
I've heard him talk about it since. And one of the arguments often made is Gorbachev got it wrong. He shouldn't have relaxed political control before he'd got economic reforms in place, because what you ended up with was a dissatisfied population who then protested, and then the whole thing collapsed. Whereas the way the Chinese did it, which is you had economic reforms, but a lot of political control, I mean, it's still a Communist Party-controlled country, had it the right way round because you kept the lid on. When this argument was made to him subsequently, Gorbachev would say, well, no, you have to understand this is Russia. I know Russians, and Russians need to speak out. They needed to feel liberated in order to feel that they were part of this. And I understand what he means, because I think it would be very easy for them just to see it as a whole lot of new party slogans. I mean, to begin with, people did. They just thought, oh, this is the party. It's window dressing for us, it's window dressing for the West, to try and improve relations because they're worried about the arms race, but they don't really want to change things properly. And actually, to a certain extent, to begin with, he probably didn't want to have root and form change. He was General Secretary of the Communist Party. To remain in control and be able to order things, he had to remain supreme leader. And in fact, as reforms became more radical, pushed partly from below, he was sawing off the branch he was sitting on, which was the reason why, in the end, he had to leave. I think he wanted to galvanise the intelligentsia behind him as the sort of thinking people of Russia, who'd been waiting for reform. There'd been an attempt at reform in the 60s, which was crushed when Khrushchev was ousted and Brezhnev and his allies came in. And he wanted to reactivate them. And Gorbachev's an intellectual. These were his people. So he had a lot of links with playwrights, with newspaper and journal editors, with academics, and they were encouraged to push the boundaries. People were very excited about what was appearing in the press. And I think also one of his allies, his close advisors, Alexander Yakovlev, who was in charge of ideology for the Politburo, always understood that unless you are open, unless you open up to your own history and to what's wrong, you can't cure yourself. He championed Memorial, which is this group which was set up to look into the people who'd been repressed under Stalin, something that had always been put under the carpet. Of course, now you could argue it's being put under the carpet again. But there was this big push to try and to get enthusiasm, I think, behind reforms, to make people feel it was real. I mean, other things were happening that weren't just about words on the page. He was releasing all the political prisoners. Sakharov was returned from exile. Within a couple of years, he was an MP. other political prisoners who were big news in the West were released. Some were allowed to go to the West if they wanted. Others just got their freedom back. The poet Irina Vereshchynskaya, she was a big deal at the Reykjavik summit of 1986. Her case was brought up. But I don't think that Gorbachev was just doing this to offer a sugar pill to the West. I think this was part of a much bigger enterprise to galvanize people behind him. And later, he would talk about how he needed to have the Russian people on his side so that he was more powerful in arguing against his critics in the Politburo. But it's always difficult when you hear these people talk in hindsight, leaders who last a very long time into retirement, how much they're telling you what they've thought subsequently, or is it really what they thought at the time? But probably there was something in that if you have grassroots support from below, then if you can harness it, then it makes you very powerful against people who might try to block what you're doing. What you could say happened in his case is that the enthusiasm from below took over and had its own momentum, particularly when it came to the Soviet republics, where the lid had been kept very tightly on places like Ukraine, Baltics, and he couldn't stop them wanting to go the way of Eastern Europe and breaking free.
You mentioned that you reported from some of the big summits.
Yeah.
Were you aware then of how the arc of history was changing, and these were precursors to perhaps the end of the Cold War, or was it not so obvious at the time?
You have to remember that to begin with, we were all super skeptical. I mean, I was skeptical, my colleagues were, so were the Soviet people, because the communist leadership in the Soviet Union had a long history of peddling propaganda and outright lies, saying things were true when they absolutely were not. And so it was always difficult to know when things were being said. You know, were they just talking the talk? Were they going to walk the walk? I remember the first summit, 1985, I wasn't there in Geneva, end of 1985, when Reagan met Gorbachev. And they had a walk in the woods and they got on relatively well. It broke the ice. Nothing was decided. They met again in Reykjavik at the end of 86, and again nothing was decided. But it somehow moved things forward, and then just a month or so afterwards, these political prisoners, dissidents, were released, and you began to think, well, hang on, something's actually happening here. And then things moved quite quickly. 1987, I think it was. I might have my years mixed up. It was 87 or 88. Reagan came to Moscow, and I remember being there for that. And I was reporting for BBC World Service, and I thought, well, the most useful thing I can do is I'm not going to get to the top people. I'm not going to get an interview with Gorbachev or Shevardnadze, the foreign minister. But I'll put in bids for the deputy foreign ministers, most of whom were English-speaking, were a career of diplomats. And I remember doing one with the deputy foreign minister with responsibility for Asia, who said to me, we're going to pull out of Afghanistan. And I thought, yeah, propaganda. And I reported it, and, it went out on the headline on the BBC World Service. But I didn't think, wow, this is it, because I didn't know whether to believe him or not. So, it's a slow process of year by year, and you start saying, wait a minute. And then I remember coming back from that visit, not so much stunned by the pronouncements of the Deputy Foreign Minister on Afghanistan, but more by the rumours I heard from my friends that Gorbachev was going to call a special party conference to discuss political reform and the party's ruling monopoly on power. And I just thought, that's extraordinary that they're even going to discuss it. And I remember going back to London and saying to my editor, Reagan's visit was interesting, but I tell you, the most interesting thing happened at this conference. And he said, okay, go straight back. So I did. And in fact, I got, through my contacts, we got permission to broadcast from inside Radio Moscow, which was good in one way, because this is way before, ISDNs or iPhones or anything like that. It was always a nightmare to broadcast. It meant we could get a circuit straight to London, and I wanted to broadcast several times a day. But also, by some, mistake, who knows what, we got a live feed of the conference. All in Russian, of course. But, there would be Yeltsin standing up and saying, no, maybe, I don't know if Yeltsin's still around. But anyway, reformers standing up and talking about the need to moved for the party to share power, and leading conservatives saying we can't do this. And I was listening to all of it. It's absolutely astonishing. And then would report it back to London. So it was about that time I began to think the story of the Soviet Union now is about what happens internally. It's this battle between the reformers and the hardliners, with Gorbachev sitting in the middle, manoeuvring, and actually it's not entirely sure how far he wanted it to go. But insofar as he even allowed this battle to happen, that meant he probably wanted reform. And then a year, I guess that was 88, because the year later, in 89, he brought in this new parliament. It was called the Congress of People's Deputies, and people were elected from all over the country, and including the republics, who all sent a lot of them sent quite outspoken radical people, lots of intellectuals. Sakharov was an MP, and they suddenly had a platform to stand up and challenge the party. The party already had a certain number of reserved seats because they didn't really want to kind of stand up and be counted. But all these people were dying to say what they thought, and Gorbachev arranged for it to be broadcast all day and every day on television. And I remember going, I can't remember where in the provinces, in some hotel, and on every floor there'd be the old ladies who was the dejurne, the ladies who would sort of keep an eye on you. They used to keep an eye on people coming in and out, but they were there to sort of just basically have a job in their old age. And they were all clustered around the television, watching the proceedings with open mouth. You know, and that's partly what brought the country rolling forward to the eventual demise, which happened 2 years later, helped along, of course, by what happened in Eastern Europe.
And do you think that is what Gorbachev wanted? Was he confident enough to let the internal dynamic drive it, or was it actually an unintended consequence of
I think he wanted reform. He felt that the system didn't work. He was worried about reforming the economy because he was afraid that if you got rid of the centrally planned economy and subsidized prices and allowed prices to float free, there'd be riots because people wouldn't be used to it and wouldn't. So he held back on economic reform for that reason so long that the shops' shelves were empty anyway. So he didn't win on that one. And people like Yeltsin were saying, no, we need radical shock therapy to sort this out. And of course, when he came in, that's what happened after 91. But on the political front, I think he felt that the Communist Party was becoming a force not for reform, but for holding back reform. And so there had to be, I think his original idea was it should regenerate itself. That's certainly the message that was given to communist parties in different East European countries. I was there in Poland in June of 1989 when they had their first half-free elections. There was a round table with Solidarity, which had been banned, and it was agreed they'd have elections, there'd be a certain number of seats reserved for communists, same kind of deal as what happened in the Soviet Union, and others would be, seats which people like Solidarity representatives could apply for. I remember being in the in the Warsaw BBC office, and one of my colleagues from Newsnight came in from filming in the villages, and he said, "It's fascinating what's happening out there. We're asking people how they voted. It was election day." He said, "All these old ladies with their spectacles on, they said, I just looked to see who the communists were, and I put a line through all of them." So what happened was that the communists got voted out. They weren't given a chance to be, reformists. So antagonistic were people towards the Communist Party, because in all these countries, particularly in the Soviet Union, they had had their own elite private world, which people were angry about. So Gorbachev was part of that elite, but he didn't understand, I think, quite how, the kind of people I'd been living among in Voronezh in the mid-1970s, how very frustrated they were with their life, and how angry they were with the party for being, it's like George Orwell's Animal Farm. Some pigs are more equal than others.
Exactly.
So I think that was a bit of a blind spot, if you like, because he certainly wanted parties to reform, and this is what the East German communist leadership, Honecker and Krenz, and those visits, Gorbachev's visit to Berlin in the autumn of '89. I was there when he went to the 40th anniversary of the GDR, And he stood on a platform next to Honecker, and Honecker said, "We'll be here another 40 years." They only lasted a few more weeks. But the message that we understand that Gorbachev gave was, it's up to you. You have to reform. Of course, the East German communist leadership was very resistant, and they didn't last.
Is that because they were not prepared to give up that position of privilege, or was it?
Well, I think, they would say, and actually, now in Russia, I would say, what I understand from people who probably should know these things is that Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev thought Gorbachev was an idiot. He was an idiot to think that he could lift the lid off and just a little bit and reform it a bit and carry on. It was never going to work.
Once the genie's out, the genie's out. So, and then when did you go back to Moscow full time?
As a correspondent?
Yes.
I went in July 1989. The BBC, I was going there a lot and doing all these reports, and the BBC decided it needed to expand its bureau because the news was just every day. There were so many different things happening. And they knew I spoke Russian, so they asked me to apply for the job and gave it to me. I thought almost the next thing that happened was that the correspondent I was supposed to go to work with was thrown out as an alleged spy. There was a big tit-for-tat expulsion. People forget that now. They think there's just a single arc of, relations getting better. But actually in 89, these things are bumpy. And in 89, there was this big expulsion of diplomats and journalists by Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. It was in response to, I think it was in response to the information that Oleg Gordievsky, the double agent working for Britain, who had been the number one resident in the Soviet embassy in London, and then they managed to, and then gone back to Russia, but the British intelligence services managed to smuggle him out, and he'd given them a lot of information on who was working for these security services in London. So there'd been a big British expulsion of Soviets. So I think this was the tit for tat to match it. But it meant that when I went to Moscow, I had to run the bureau on my own instead of being with someone else because he'd gone. But obviously it felt very much the Cold War. So, you think, by July 1989, things were getting better. Well, they were. There was this new parliament, which was being broadcast on television with all the cleaning ladies and Desjardins watching it. And a platform for dissidents and nationalists and what have you. But then on the other hand, they kicked out all these Brits. And, I still felt we were very much foreigners. The capitalist correspondent brigade in a world which is still very Soviet. And I remember thinking when I went out there that perhaps I was also aware that the Conservatives high up in the Politburo and their supporters were beginning to speak out against reforms. And so we could see this battle beginning to happen. And I was very worried that when I went as a correspondent, what I would find myself reporting on was the slow end of reforms and a return to the status quo. This is, after all, what happened in the 1960s when Khrushchev was ousted. And to begin with, people thought, well, maybe it won't be so bad when Brezhnev comes in. But actually, if you look back at what happened after Khrushchev went and the show trials of dissidents and then, the battle with Solzhenitsyn in the end kicked out, things got much worse internally, but probably in relation to the West. And I thought that that might happen again and that Gorbachev might not last and that the Communist Party, which had been all-powerful for 70 years, would regroup and spit out this reformer. And what I would have to try and explain to the West, who are very excited about arms control summits and, dissidents being released and so on, was that that was then, but things are getting worse again. And of course, that might have been the case if the coup which happened in 1991 had succeeded. There could have been a reversion. And after all, in recent years, we have seen a period of liberalization in Russia be followed by a period of retrenchment. So I don't think I was wrong to think that. It just turned out that I was, as it turned out, completely incorrect. And that is not what happened at all. But it's interesting when you think about it. And there were things about my daily life that reinforced that view. So at the apartment block where we lived, all foreigners, all Westerners, a policeman on the door, would take the passport of any Russian who wanted to come in and speak to us. So on the whole, they didn't. They were worried about what would happen to them, or what would happen to their passport. But I would get calls from people who'd say, they've managed to get a call through to the Moscow office, say, I'd like to come meet you and talk about something. Will you meet me in a local park? I remember a coal miner from one of the northern coalfields in Vorkuta wanted to come and tell me about the strike they were planning. A devastating strike as it happened, certainly politically. The proletariat rising up against the Communist Party that's supposed to protect the proletariat. But he was not going to come anywhere near the bureau because of the KGB. So we walked in a circle around a local park, and that happened a lot. And I remember another weekend, I haven't been there very long, thinking, oh, it would be nice to go out for a walk in the forest outside Moscow one Sunday afternoon, driving out in my correspondent car with the correspondent plates, and you get stopped at the ring road. Policeman waves you over. He says, you're a foreigner. You're a foreign correspondent. I can tell by your plate. Go back to Moscow. Why can't we go for a walk in the park, in the forest? Because you're not allowed beyond the city perimeter. It's a new rule. So, little things like that would make you think, well, maybe the tide is turning. But actually, it was just a period of, who knows where that rule came from. Maybe that came from some conservative member of the Politburo without Gorbachev knowing. There were lots of other little incidents that crackdowns on protests made you think,
That's quite hard to imagine now when we look back at the broader arc of what we know happened.
Yeah.
With the science of hindsight. To think that Gorbachev might have been a Khrushchev part two, that's...
Well, lots of things that he might have, yes. In the end he was, of course, in a way ousted by Yeltsin, but that was not the communists. The communists were banned for quite a long time. But I think what's the other thing you have to remember is that even though all these things were happening, it was quite hard to know where Gorbachev was in all of this, because he was being very careful in his public statements not to align himself too closely with the reformers. And as they became more radical, he probably wasn't fully aligned with them. So at the beginning of 1991, there was this attack on Vilnius. To backtrack a bit, after 1989 and the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and one by one the Eastern European countries basically freed themselves of communism and said they wanted to end the Warsaw Pact. It was pretty clear Eastern Europe had gone free, and lots of people in the West think the end of communism was 1989. Not so in the Soviet Union. The Communist Party was still there. And to come back to one of your earlier questions, Gorbachev's red line was, okay, well, if Germany wants to do that, or Hungary, or Poland, that's fine. They are autonomous countries, and there is no longer a Brezhnev doctrine, and we're not going to invade like we did in 1968. But when it comes to the Soviet Union, that's a different matter. Constituent republics cannot secede unilaterally. So he began to have a big argument with the Baltics, who were all saying, but we became part of the Soviet Union against our will as part of the Second World War or after it, and we want to leave now. And if East Germany can, or Poland next door, why can't we? And he went there and argued with them. And of course what he was worried about, quite rightly as it turned out, was that if the Baltics went free, well, it would be Ukraine next, and Georgia, and then the Central Asian republics who'd love to keep the proceeds of their oil and cotton receipts and not send them to Moscow to be redistributed by the central authorities. So he was worried about a bigger collapse, and also how his opponents of reform in Moscow would react, and maybe they would lose patience with him. So at the beginning of 91, there was a famous attack overnight on the Vilnius Parliament. It was a classic operation by the local Soviet garrisons to surround the Parliament and seize it, and also seize radio and TV. It's interesting now, isn't it? Because nowadays seizing radio and TV wouldn't have any meaning. You just go on social media.
Exactly, yeah.
But in those days, that was still meaningful. They didn't manage because Lithuanians came out in force, and there were also some Western journalists there. And I think 17 people were killed, but it didn't last. But it did raise a question mark in all our minds. I was in Moscow at the time. Did Gorbachev order this? In which case, is he really a reformer? If he's, cracking down like that, in a kind of 1968 style way, there were tanks then. Or did he not know? In which case is he so weak that we have something else to worry about? And in response to that, he's talked about in interviews and in his autobiography, he got in touch with the American ambassador, Jack Matlock, to send a message to George H. Bush to say, I'm going to have to zigzag. Just stay with me, trust me, but I'm going to have to zigzag. By then, Shevardnadze had resigned, and foreign minister saying there's a creeping dictatorship coming. And Gorbachev had brought in a new government, which was, well, you only had to look at them and you can see they're a pretty unsavoury lot. And many of those were the people who then staged a coup against him later that year. So we had a lot of reasons as correspondents to think, just whose side is Gorbachev on? Was he now so weak that actually he's no longer a reformer? You know, endless questions all the time. It wasn't a clear narrative at all.
And when you look back at the Cold War now, you know, several years after perhaps it ended, how should we remember a war which perhaps never happened? Is your book one answer to this? How do we do that?
Well, I wonder if that's right to say it never happened, because there wasn't the nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. You know, those 90% of the world's nuclear weapons that they both hold were not used in anger against each other. That is true. But when they, and this certainly came home to me in compiling the radio series and then the book, and looking at episode by episode, that I think probably after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when they realized how dangerous it was, but certainly through the 60s, there was a recognition that these weapons were too dangerous to use. And there was a kind of agreement that you have to live with each other. I mean, it was manifested, for example, in Ostpolitik, the agreement between the leaders of East and West Germany to sort of live with each other and accept that both Germanys were going to be there. You know, Germany, I think, you know, I certainly felt that working on this project, Germany is the fulcrum. Germany is where it began, and actually Germany is sort of where it ended, if you like, when the Berlin Wall came down. So whatever happened between the two Germanys was always a very significant indicator of the bigger relations. But I think also if you look at what happened after the high point of the Cold War, if you like, the Cuban Missile Crisis, what happened is that the conflict dissipated into proxy wars and regional conflicts. So there was the Vietnam War, there was the attack on Allende in Chile, first socialist president in Latin America. There was Angola, which kicked off in the mid-1970s. I mean, millions and millions of people died in that war. And then, of course, there was Afghanistan, starting from 79. The consequences of which are still with us. So I think to say it never happened, perhaps that's not the right way to put it when you think of all the lives lost and the damage that was done in different places around the world. You know, Latin America, the wars in El Salvador and Nicaragua, people don't talk about them now, but these were devastating wars for many people, and they were the result, if you like, of the nuclear capitals, Washington and Moscow, deciding that mad, mutually assured destruction was a doctrine they both actually signed up to, and therefore that they weren't going to unleash weapons on each other. So instead, they were going to kill through proxies.
I certainly think that's one part that comes through very well in the book, is understanding the broader perspectives of the Cold War. Yes, we know about the macro blocks, but the bloody wars of proxy around the globe, and I think that the first-hand accounts that come out from that really do bring it to life. Just ask one question about the Cuban Missile Crisis. You said that was the peak of risk in the Cold War, but then again in 1983 with Able Archer, and arguably, at least with the Cuban Missile Crisis, they knew what was happening. It was only perhaps ex post that they realised what had happened with the miscommunication that went around
Able Archer. Well, I mean, there are two things there. There's Able Archer and there's the shooting down of the Korean airliner, which was probably publicly made a bit more impact. I remember being I just joined the BBC when the Korean airliner was shot down. So this was a South Korean airliner that strayed into Soviet space and a Soviet pilot shot it down. How many people killed? Over 200, I can't remember. I remember saying to my colleagues at the BBC, I bet this was just some young Soviet pilot following the rules or being told by his, I bet this wasn't actually an attempt to start World War III. I think this is just,
a rogue pilot.
Not exactly a rogue pilot, but just, if you think about, the adherence to rules and bureaucracy, and if you're in that kind of society, you think you'll be in terrible trouble if you don't do what you're supposed to do. And you're probably not that good about thinking about the bigger picture. I mean, actually, there are reports of submarine commanders in the Cuban Missile Crisis who did take very important decisions not to push that over the limit. But I kind of think the Korean airliner was a sort of mishap. And I think quite quickly that both sides knew that it wasn't, this wasn't an intentional shooting down, it was an accident. And they stepped back. Abel Archer, there's some quite interesting articles being written about this, raising the question of whether in fact the Soviet interpretation of the military exercise, which was an exercise partly walking through what might happen if you're going towards nuclear war, that this was the real thing and that they put their systems on alert and so on. The backstory to this is partly that Andropov had said we need to be alert to the West and we're afraid that they really are preparing for war. And again, if you understand Soviet society and the way people felt that they had to give their superiors what they wanted, it's completely possible that some of the reporting was that it looks as though this could be moving towards war by people who didn't actually quite believe it, but were saying it because that's what maybe they expected to say. So it's quite complicated. But I think that, it is quite interesting that if you look at I don't know, I was there at the time. I can't say that I felt we were about to go to a nuclear war. It didn't feel like that. It's more, Reagan had ramped up the arms race. Andropov was quite harsh. But I suppose it felt more like today, where relations are bad. But I don't think we think that the West and Putin's Russia want to go to war with each other. There's always a worry about doing something by accident. That's always there, but then that's there anyway. Whereas I think with the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was quite early in the nuclear age. And it was the first time people thought really hard and, really hard about these things and thought through the consequences. So one of the eyewitness reports we had from then was of a man who was in Brooklyn at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he was a small boy, and his mother was watching developments on the radio, maybe television, and one afternoon she called them all into the kitchen, her children, and said, "Listen, children, I just want you to know I love you, because we may all die this afternoon." Well, I can't think of anything subsequent to that, moments of high tension, where it's got to that point. So I think I still stick to the Cuban Missile Crisis being the high point.
Interesting. Although I think one point that comes out in either the radio program or the book is that actually when you look at the proximity of Alaska to the Soviet Union, that of course is a lot closer than Cuba ever was. But it was something that perhaps was an arrival of missiles and the change of the status quo that caused the states to become uncertain. Yeah.
But we live with it today, don't we? The Russian president says, we're going to put missiles in Kaliningrad, or we're going to put them in Crimea, and we think, that's upping the ante. But we don't think anymore that nuclear war's around the corner.
No.
We're so worried about other sorts of wars, I suppose.
I remember on the BBC when the doomsday scientists would move the doomsday clock 1 minute closer to midnight, and as a child of the 70s, I watched Threads, and I was sure at some point, it felt like the world was going to come to an end. I guess it didn't. But your book, let's just turn to your book, A New All History of the Cold War. If I just read a little bit about what it says. So it's against a backdrop of a global ideological conflict. This book chronicles the impact felt by ordinary citizens, many of whom found themselves with ringside seats or pivotal roles as key episodes unfolded. These are the unsung foot soldiers of the Cold War. So why did you choose to look at an ideological conflict from a human point of view?
I think it started as a radio series, and then we got such fabulous material, we thought we had to make a book out of it. And I think we thought that it would be fresher, that we'd heard a lot from the diplomats and the generals and the, reminiscences of the people in charge. And we wanted to hear about the people on the ground. And, when you look through the decades, what are we talking about, 4 decades? There are lots of personal stories and lots of moments. You say this is a war that never happened, but there were lots of moments of drama and crisis, which you can actually say in this place at this moment, wow, what was it like? Hungary, Revolution of 1956, the Berlin air blockade at the end of the 40s, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Very real.
That anybody who was there at the time, it's worth hearing their story. So we just wanted to make it feel, just real. And also, there are, I suppose, focusing on the victims does bring home the fact that this was not a war without consequences. There were terrible consequences. One of the most heart-rending episodes was the one we did on the Korean War, and we decided just to focus on the refugees. And I remember my producer, who most of the interviews were in Korean. We got a collaborator in Korea to interview the people. We sent the questions, and then got it translated. And I remember my producer ringing me up and saying, "I've just been working through the transcripts, and I can't stop crying. It's so awful." These people who were, first it was the war went one way, and then the Chinese got involved and they went another way, and all these people fleeing North Korea and families on the road. I remember there's an American soldier we interviewed who was there who said, it was just biblical, just this stream of people. And then the eyewitness we got of people who, my father let go of my hand and I went on towards the south. I never saw him again. Or someone who'd left their mother behind in the north because she was going to stay with the smaller children. And now she's in North Korea, and she died a few years ago and you never saw her again. Just devastating stories. So that felt to us much more compelling and important in a way than to hear what the, American ambassador was thinking in Seoul or whatever.
And I think that was, for me, listening and reading, I was struck by the parallels between the world today and the period covered in the book. I thought about the Vietnamese boat people.
Yes.
And the people crossing the Mediterranean today.
Yes, that's right.
You talk about the refugees. We talk about interference in elections in Italy and Czechoslovakia,
yes,
and perhaps in the West now.
Yes.
Let's not speculate. But this history from the Cold War really echoes into the current period.
Yeah, it's true. And also, one side echoed the other. So, on the Vietnam War, we thought, we'll tell the story through American vets. And that was very powerful. These young boys, idealistic boys who went out there thinking they're going to help the South Vietnamese. And then they turn up and find they're the people shooting at them. And then after a while, after you've been there a bit, you just trying to stay alive. And you start to hate them. And you do unspeakable things to them, or you see people do unspeakable things to them. No wonder so many of them came home a wreck. But then, when we came on to do the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which is quite complex, they actually didn't want to go in. They were asked and refused, and then subsequently they agreed to go in, and then it's blossomed into this war. Well, that has resonances today as well, with NATO's involvement there. But what was interesting was we again decided to tell it from the story of Soviet vets, and they, interestingly too, so many of them thought that they were going to help the Afghans, and the socialist, the communist side was the side for literacy and liberating women and education against the Dark Ages and the sort of religious mullahs who just wanted to keep people oppressed. It seemed very clear to them that they were on the side of the right. And then when they got there, of course, they found they were under attack from everyone, and that they're inside, unspeakable things happening. And what was worse for them was that they found that if they wanted to report that back, either they weren't allowed to or no one would listen. And again, when they came home, I remember when I was correspondent there, you'd see Vietnam vets begging in the underground, sometimes limbless, because they came home and there wasn't the support for them. In collapsing Soviet Union, there's no room for prostheses. But it was there were huge parallels between the two superpowers sending their young men off to wars in distant places.
I remember I used to row, and my rowing coach took us to Henley one year, and he said he remembered in the late 60s, in the early 70s, when the American colleges, who are big contributors to those kind of reactors, just didn't turn up.
Right.
They didn't have the young men to send.
Yeah.
And when you hear it at that level, it's and the parallels you draw between Afghanistan and Vietnam, it's shocking.
I mean, we did try to do some episodes and chapters which were less known stories. Partly it was to have a proper spread. So we wanted to do something from the Middle East. So we did the assassination of the Iranian Prime Minister in 1953. But it was also because we wanted to throw light on important things that aren't normally thrown light on. So the Angolan War was one. But another was a second look at the Vietnam War, and it was the consequences after what happened in Cambodia and how that was linked to the coming of Pol Pot.
Yes.
And the complicated relationships in that part of the world between Soviet proxies and Chinese proxies and the Americans. So we wanted to give some sense of follow-through, but also how very complicated it was. You think of George Orwell's 1984, three great powers, and they keep shifting sides, who's allied to who. It's not straightforward. It wasn't just us and them. There was a third party in the room, and that was China, and all that shifted.
So which one of the stories in the books best encapsulates the contradictions, conflicts, and chaos of the Cold War?
Well, arguably, maybe the second one about what can I say? I don't know, that's a hard one. I mean, the Korean program, because it's about these refugees, this sense of how people's lives are just swept aside, and that's a very simple story in a way. It's the story of all refugees. The second Vietnam one, which is about Cambodia, and what happened after the helicopter took off from the roof. Maybe that's quite a good one for understanding how complicated it was, and how parties shifted, and different people got caught up in different ways. So I don't know.
I found it very interesting to read in the end, as the Second World War was ending, how enemies became friends.
Yeah, this is the Greek
greater
story.
Enemy, the Greek
so
one,
here
yes.
you are, end of 1944. The World War II is not over yet, but most of Greece has been liberated, and Athens is liberated last of all. And the Brits decide they've helped have the king in exile, and they want to bring the monarchists back. But their allies, the communist partisans, are horrified. And within months, they were on opposite sides of the barricades in a really bloody war, with air power and a lot of devastation. And people are still marching towards Berlin. D-Day is still to come. It's extraordinary.
And it struck me also that you take that, the friends become enemies, and vice versa. When you look at the Taliban in Afghanistan, there's a James Bond film where they're the heroes supported by the Americans with the Stinger missiles. Not many years later, the coin is flipped and the other happens. And that part of history always fascinates me.
Yeah.
As how you can talk and then not talk, or vice versa.
Yeah.
But so, just as we close, just some questions of you're in your nuclear bunker, civilization's collapsing outside. You haven't had enough of the Cold War. Which piece of Cold War fiction would you take in with you?
Okay, so I had not one answer to this, but several. So I think John le Carré's books, Smiley's People, they're the Cold War par excellence, aren't they? Because that's the spy war is very much part of the Cold War. So any of his smiley books, or all of them. But I also wonder, from the Russian side, it's about the Battle of Stalingrad, but it was written in the Soviet period, so I think it reflects. It's a contemplation on what life is like under totalitarianism, and that is Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate, which if you've not read it, you really must.
I have it. So it's a very thick book, isn't it?
Yeah.
But was he a journalist for
he
the
was
Soviets?
A journalist, yes, for the Red Star. Yeah. So in fact, it wasn't published in the Soviet Union. It was too devastating because it talks about not just the army but the political officers and
the brutality of the system that drove people forward.
Yeah, and people, the prison system and the German side too. And then the other one, which I think is at the other end of the spectrum, at the end, I really like Svetlana Alexievich's books. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature 4 years ago. And she was a Soviet journalist in the 80s from Belarus. And after a while, she began to think that what Soviet journalism, or the sort of Soviet narrative of big events that traumatized people, said was always really a lie, because it was heroic and it all joined up. And so the story of the Second World War was always a heroic battle which the Soviet Union won, whereas she remembered the stories that her mother and aunts and grandmothers used to tell her in the villages in Belarus, and how messy it was, and families were divided and ordinary life was disrupted. So she went around interviewing mostly women, all women actually, to get their stories of basically what happened in Belarus as the Germans swept through and then the Soviets swept back, and put it together. She takes bits of interview and puts them together in little collages. So sometimes she says who's speaking, sometimes she doesn't. So it's almost like a narrative poem, but it's got such integrity. And she's done that with, it's called The Unwomanly Face of War. That's about the Second World War. She's done it with Chernobyl, with the view from the ground of Chernobyl, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Not what the scientists thought and the journalists from Kiev and the experts who came from the West and so on, but the ordinary villagers, what it felt like to have this done to you, and suddenly you're being told to get onto buses and leave, or, you're worrying about your health and so on. She's done it with the Afghan war. So she has her book were about the Afghan boys, but also the mothers who followed them to Afghanistan to try and bring them home. Mm. And her most recent, I don't know if it's any longer her most recent one, but another recent one, it's called Secondhand Time. And it's about ordinary Russians and Belarusians' experience of the end of the Soviet Union. And so on the one hand, there are some people who are jubilant and they think it's all going to be wonderful. And then there are others who are dismayed. Maybe they work for the party, their world collapses around them, they were important officials, now they're pensioners. And then she talks to them about what their view was when it was happening. And then she asks them what they feel now. And sometimes, the woman who was so jubilant now says, oh, it's all gone wrong. And whereas the other woman has said, well, maybe it's good the Communist Party went. But again, it's this collage effect. I recommend them all. They are a very different type of oral history, somewhere on the margin between documentary evidence and fiction. She says she would call it fiction, but it's not just fiction. So people who like your podcast might like those.
We will certainly put those on the show notes. I was wondering if you've seen the film From Us to Me.
No.
Which is a film shot in Rostock. Female shipyard workers, crane operators, right, and then a fishing business. And a film crew went out, I think, in the mid-80s, recorded these people who were driving these amazing cranes. The life, there was the person who was most in favour of the party, there was the person who was least. And then that same film crew went back more recently.
Oh, right.
And looked at how they changed. Yeah. And it was very interesting, just as you say, that some felt it was the best thing in the end, some people felt it was the worst, a lot of people couldn't deal with the uncertainty. it was what was most interesting to me is the woman who'd been very much a party person beforehand, then became the arch capitalist.
Yeah.
On the other side, sort of a very successful travel agency business, and I could sense that sudden loss of a state, that disappearance of a world, for all of them was very, very difficult. And that's a very good film.
Yeah. So I remember I was very struck by the chapter on the fall of the Berlin Wall. We decided we wouldn't do the fall of the Berlin Wall. Lots of people have done that. Instead, we talked to former East Germans about their reaction to it. And there was again this sense of jubilation. There's one woman she was a kind of radio DJ, and suddenly she could play all these songs she'd never been allowed to play before. But then her radio station was taken over, and then she was out of a job because it was submerged with another one from the West. And suddenly she was somehow a second-class citizen. And that journey from jubilation to a new world where you don't quite fit, and then you start feeling a bit nostalgic. In the end, she emigrated, actually, started a new life, that woman. Yeah. Reminds me of that film, that film, Goodbye Lenin?
Yes.
It's kind of bittersweet nostalgia for something that's gone. Of course, onto the subject of nostalgia of the Soviet Union, I get a bit frustrated now that when I hear young Russians talk nostalgically about the Soviet Union, repeating the words they've heard from their grandparents, I feel like wagging my finger and saying, it wasn't like that. Let me tell you about Voronezh.
You mentioned Chernobyl, and you said we haven't seen the television series. Did you mention the Russians are doing one themselves?
I don't have proper... I've heard they were, but I don't really know the details.
Okay. And what film or television programme do you think best encapsulates the Cold War? You mentioned Goodbye Lenin.
Yes. Well, that's post, isn't it?
Yes.
Post Cold War.
What is it that the Russians have produced in a post-Cold War environment that perhaps we haven't seen or don't have access to that gives their view of what went on?
I don't think I'm current enough on that to be able to tell you. I'm sure there's lots of great stuff. I don't know. I tell you one thing I really enjoyed, which is American, is that it's a television series called The Americans.
Yes.
Which is a fabulous story, which you might think was high fiction, but because we know it's true because of Anna Chapman and her colleagues, of putting illegals in the United States at a very young age to grow up as Americans, who then they or their children could be placed in high positions and report back to the Soviet Union. I love it because I love the psychology of it. There was two such different worlds, Cold War America and Cold War Soviet Union. Of course, these illegals living as Americans with American children had no idea what their parents did, were gradually losing touch with the old Soviet Union. So what they were remembering was just a memory. It wasn't what was happening now. But in the later episodes of the final parts of the series, I thought it very well encapsulated what life was like in Moscow just in the last years, because some of the action moved to Moscow. So I enjoyed that a lot. It rang quite true in some ways.
Fantastic. And you have clearly written a fantastic piece of non-fiction. What non-fiction book were you taking with you? Non-fiction.
Well, I think I might go for quite sort of hefty books, perhaps, like Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago or the Mitrokhin Archive. Because if you're on a desert island, you've got lots of time. There's all this fascinating detail in it about what really went on. Well, the Mitrokhin Archive is, of course, he was an archivist for the KGB. He brought stuff out, so it's his compilation, and so through his editorial filter. But even so, a lot of detail there. So I think rather than a narrative work, I would probably go with those two just to delve into. But if you wanted to talk about an overarching book which sort of tells the whole story, I think my former professor at my old college in Oxford, in St Antony's, Professor Archie Brown, has written a very good book on the end of communism, which takes, I think that's right. Is it The Rise and Fall of Communism? I'll have to check. It's over here on the bookshelf. That's right, The Rise and Fall of Communism by Archie Brown. So if he's a fantastic academic. He's so meticulous. He's a biographer of Gorbachev, and he has gone back to lots of original sources, and he takes each place and episode, and so that's a very good non-fiction book.
I read. We were just talking just now about the Korean airliner. I read the book by Taylor Downing, 1983, and what I found very interesting is that the Americans were in that area. Is it called the Oshkosh Sea? Were not non-belligerent.
Yeah.
They were flying jets fast at boundaries and then turning away or just crossing over. And so you can just see it all sort of ramping up, and then this thing being the cherry on top of the cake.
Well, the Kursk submarine disaster in the north of Russia, 2001. Putin hadn't been in power, or maybe 2000. I think 2000. I think it was his first year as president, and it sank. Yes. And for a long, long time, the Russians said that it was NATO's fault.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe there were NATO submarines in the area. So it's not to say that they attacked the submarine, but maybe the submarine thought they were there and therefore, reacted in a way which led to the accident. These things are always much more complicated than you think.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
A pleasure.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you. And we will put details of the book and all the books and films that have been mentioned on the podcast notes. But thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks again to James for that fascinating chat with Bridget Kendall. If you'd like to learn more and maybe didn't get a chance to write down those book recommendations, then head over to our show notes, which are at coldwarconversations.com/79. There'll also be a link in some podcast apps too. Don't forget, if you'd like to get a Cold War Conversations coaster and help keep us on the air, head over to patreon.com/coldwarpod, or again, click on the link in your podcast app. You can also help us by leaving reviews on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, our Facebook page, or with your favourite podcast provider. This really helps to raise our profile and get new guests on the show. And if you can't wait for the next episode, do visit our Facebook discussion group, where our guests and listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Just search for us in Facebook. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.